Hello friends and neighbors, I'm Matt Guy and this chair barely fits in this space, and today we're going to talk about a recent movie trend. Today's vlog comes in two parts, and it's about parts. I'm something, aren't I? As most of us are already aware, the makers of the Harry Potter movies decided that with Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the final installment of the Harry Potter series, they would split the movie into two parts. And so we have Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. Why did they decide this was necessary? Well, there's a cynical argument and a non-cynical argument. The cynical argument is simply that the movie makers wanted to make more money. They wanted to milk the Harry Potter franchise for all it was worth and make one extra movie to make a little bit of extra money. And the non-cynical argument is simply that they wanted to do justice to this last story and they wanted to be as faithful as possible and include as much as possible, and the only way to do that adequately was to split the movie into two parts. And to be honest, I think it's probably a combination of both arguments. I think the initial idea came from the fact that they wanted to include as much in the movie as possible, but I think a major upside was the fact that they would be making more money. But this seems to have started a trend among movie makers, as we now have The Twilight Saga Breaking Dawn, Parts 1 and 2, The Hobbit, Parts 1 and 2, and there's even a rumor that they might be doing something similar with the Hunger Games movies. And at the beginning of the video I called it a recent movie trend, but really it's nothing new. Back when they made epic movies that ran 3 or 4 hours long, they would split those movies into two parts and have an intermission in between. The difference is, of course, that the two parts didn't get two separate releases months apart. They were all released as one movie, and they gave you a chance to stand up and stretch your legs halfway through. But movies like Ben-Hur, Patton, and even The Great Race really aren't made anymore. Now we value pith. We want our movies to be really no longer than 2.5 hours, and even that's pushing it. So instead, in order to tell a big story in a small amount of time, we just split it into two parts and have two separate movie releases. And this got me thinking about other two-parters in storytelling, specifically two-part television episodes. We've all been watching an episode of one of our favorite television shows, and the action is exciting and a lot of really great things are happening, and we're getting to that last few minutes of the episode and we start to come to the realization that they're not going to resolve all this conflict in just a few minutes that we have left. This is going to be a two-parter. And a few minutes later, they slap you with a to be continued. Typically these are season finales or season premieres, and sometimes they even come in the middle of the season, but it's basically a time when the writers of the series had a story that was so big and there was so much happening that they couldn't fit it into one episode, so they had to split it into two. And between these two parts of the episode, we get what else? A cliffhanger. We all know cliffhangers. You're going through the episode, there's all of this conflict and all of these horrible things happening, and we get to the last few seconds of the episode and someone jumps out of the shadows and points a gun at our protagonist and says, "I'm gonna kill you." And then we have it to be continued. And what's often typical of these cliffhangers is that the actual cliffhanger portion, the part that leaves us in suspense, is not a part of the overall story arc. I mean, it's a small part of it, but it's just like a few seconds out of the overall drama. There are unresolved issues in the overall drama, but that's not what gets us to come back, and that's not what leaves us hanging on the edge of the cliff. And often what'll happen is that that issue that was leaving us on the cliff and that got us to start watching the second part of the episode will be resolved within the first few seconds of part 2. So, yeah, cliffhangers kind of seem like a sort of cheap device, but even cliffhangers aren't anything new. Remember Scheherazade in 1001 Arabian Nights? She used cliffhangers. That's how Scheherazade stayed alive. She got to a certain point in the story at the end of the night, and the Emperor said, "Well, what happens next?" And she said, "Well, I can't tell you. I have to go be executed now. I guess you'll never know." And he said, "Well, we can wait another night. You have to finish the story." And serial novels from the 20s and 30s, when novels were released in segments, they used cliffhangers. Television episodes often use cliffhangers. They get people to keep watching. They get people to come back, or to buy the next thing, or to continue with the story. And is it a cheap device? Yeah, it can be, but part of storytelling is maintaining your audience, keeping your audience interested, and sometimes you have to throw those things in there in order to bring them back. And it even goes a step further into segments of individual stories. In one episode of a television series, you'll have to go to commercial a few times, and usually before they go to a commercial, they'll end on a mini cliffhanger to ensure that you stick around through the commercial break and keep watching the episode. And even book chapters will sometimes end in cliffhangers to make sure that you keep reading. One of the ways in which we often judge a good story is how gripping it is and how hard it was to put the story down because we wanted to keep reading or we wanted to keep watching. Oftentimes we will judge stories based on that surface layer, that little bit of titillation that's thrown in for us rather than the actual substance of the story. So as you can tell, I kind of have mixed feelings about cliffhangers. On the one hand, yes, they can sometimes just be cheap tricks, just a device used to get you to come back to the story and sometimes even throwing off the flow of the story just so we can have that brief moment of climax and tension. But on the other hand, if a cliffhanger is done well... Alright, Guyan. I'm making my 17th attempt at taking over this channel. Now drop the review and step aside and nobody gets hurt.